Hello and welcome to a quick video on how to apply for a variance in Baltimore. So if you need to look up something in the zoning code as you're applying for a variance, you can do so by going to our website zoning.baltimorecity.gov, and we have a link to the text of the code here over on the right hand side where the red arrow is pointing. This is the text of the zoning code, and then this is the zoning map over here on the left hand side where the blue arrow is pointing. So both of those documents together kind of create the entire code. All right, so getting started with variances. The purpose of variances is to give relief from the regulations of the zoning code when there's an unnecessary hardship or practical difficulty, and it applies to things like the bulk and yard regulations, signage, and parking and loading requirements. So this is taken straight from the code. You can look that up in the text of the code that I just showed you where to find that. So variances. A variance permits an action which is prohibited and presumed to be in conflict with the ordinance, meaning the zoning code. The general rule is that variances are rarely appropriate and that the authority to grant a variance should be exercised sparingly and only under exceptional circumstances. So we talked a little bit already about bulk and yard regulations. They are found in the tables at the very end of the code. These numbers over here are the numbers of the table that corresponds to the table at the end of the code. And the ones that we see most frequently are these ones that are highlighted in yellow. So these residential, commercial, and industrial bulk and yard regulations. The categories that you'll see when you look up your specific zoning district in the bulk and yard regulations are things like lot area, building height, lot coverage, impervious surface, and then all the dimensions surrounding a particular structure, front yard, side yard, and rear yard. So all of those dimensions of a lot and dimensions of a structure are included in the bulk and yard regulations for your zoning district. You can also get a variance from off-street parking and loading requirements, and these are the tables that have those requirements in them, and from sign regulations, which I won't get into here because those can be very complicated. So here are the approval standards in the zoning code, section 5-308, that talks about what the board has to consider when they're considering a variance application. This is very small print and very dense, so I'm really going to focus on the parts that are highlighted here that are kind of the threshold questions about whether or not the board can approve a variance. So there's a two-part test for a variance. First is uniqueness or unusualness or peculiarity of the property. And the second is a practical difficulty that has been caused by applying the code to the unique or unusual property. So there's a connection between those two tests. Uniqueness. Part one of the variance test is that the applicant has to prove that there's some sort of uniqueness about the property, which leads to a disproportionate impact of the zoning code on the property. If you can't show uniqueness, the variance approval process has to stop and the variance has to be denied by the board. So this is an extremely important part of this application. So here are some examples of unique conditions. Physical surroundings of the property, including access to nearby streets and alleys. The shape of the lot. This is kind of the classic example of if you have a triangular lot and you're trying to build a normal shaped house, like a square or rectangular house, and all the other lots on your block are rectangular, it is going to be difficult to meet, it might be anyway, the side yard requirements or the rear yard requirements if you're trying to build on that lot. So if it's irregular or unusual in some way, you may have grounds for a variance. If there's a significant slope or some other kind of topographical condition, subsurface conditions like underground streams or stormwater management issues, environmental factors, maybe you can't build on some part of your lot because there's contamination, environmental contamination on it, and it's not buildable for some reason. If there's some kind of unique historical significance that doesn't apply to the neighborhood in general, but applies specifically to this property, that might be a unique condition. and other kinds of restrictions or issues imposed by abutting properties, unusual architectural aspects, and bearing or party walls about adjacent parcels. These are all examples. It's not an exhaustive list. There could be other examples of unique conditions that are not listed here, but these are some examples of the kinds of things that have been mentioned in case law. So once we have the uniqueness proven, the applicant then has to prove that the uniqueness has led to a disproportionate negative impact on their property that creates a practical difficulty in following the code. So the uniqueness and the practical difficulty have to be tied together logically. So, for example, if we go back to the triangular lot, the uniqueness is the shape of the lot, and the practical difficulty is you can't build any kind of structure maybe on this property and also comply with the side yard and rear yard setbacks. So that's the practical difficulty. So the questions are, would compliance without a variance granted or render conformity unnecessarily burdensome? So that's kind of a judgment call by the board. Would the granting of the variance do substantial justice to the applicant and other property owners? And would the spirit of the zoning code be observed and public safety and welfare secured if the variance were granted? Self-inflicted hardship is never a proper grounds for a variance. So if you have made some kind of decision that means that now you need a variance, then the board probably cannot grant it. So for example, if you have built an unpermitted addition to your house and the city finds out about it and says, hey, you can't have that without a variance, the fact that you would need to tear down this unpermitted work is not a practical difficulty, and it's also not uniqueness. So also, mistake of a city official is also not a practical difficulty. So if the city grants you a permit by accident for something that they should not have given you a permit to do, and you build thinking that you could go forward without a variance, but it turns out you do need a variance, that in and of itself is not sufficient grounds for a variance. The board has to think about the application as if nothing had been built yet. So here are some other inadequate justifications for a variance. Community support for the variance. That's very nice and good for you, but it's not a justification for a variance if you don't have uniqueness and practical difficulty first. Things like property owner or potential homebuyer preferences, like adding a bedroom, building a larger kitchen, enlarging a staircase if it's not necessarily required, but it just would be nice. Convenience and better layout, aesthetic preferences, increasing the value of the property. Those are all not considered to be adequate justifications for a variance. Sometimes people come in to ask for variances because all the other houses on their block are already non-conforming in some way, or maybe have already been granted variances in the past. You still have to go through the uniqueness and practical difficulty standard first, which is a very hard one to meet. And just comparing your property to other properties that already have something that you want is not necessarily in and of itself a justification for a variance. So you may be thinking, having watched these past few minutes, that you don't qualify for a variance, right? Because we live in a city that is a city of row houses for the most part, and many of the lots are identical, and many of the structures on them are identical. So it makes it really difficult, or almost impossible, I would say, in many cases, to qualify for a variance. If we go back to the slides at the very beginning, variances are, under the law, under the case law, variances are rarely appropriate. So this kind of makes sense because it's a very, very high standard. So if you don't qualify for a variance, the person to talk to about that would be your city council representative. they can change the bulk and yard regulations, the parking regulations, and sign regulations at any time via city council ordinance. The approval standards for a variance, however, cannot be changed except by changing state law. And the case law is pretty clear that if there are a huge number of variance requests that seem like reasonable requests, that the problem should be addressed by legislation, by changing the code, not by giving variances. So if you're looking for the templates for the statement of justification, each of our appeals for variances, we're requiring people to submit a statement of justification, whether you're doing a conditional use or variance or both. This video is only about variances. The standard for conditional uses is much different, and maybe I'll make a video about conditional uses later. But here's where you can find the page on our website that talks about application completeness, and there's a link on our page to the templates for the statement of justification for the variance, and the templates just go over what we've already gone over in this video. So if we click on here, we go over to our website. This is what you look at, what you see when you first go to the website, and then you can either click on application completeness, which is over here on the left-hand side, and you can go to this template for statement of justification. Let's click on the PDF. It talks about you have to list the variances that you're asking for, and then you have to describe why you're asking for the variance. And you'll recognize these physical surroundings, shape, topographical conditions, or other reasons. What's unique about these conditions, and how would these unique conditions lead to a practical difficulty if the code were strictly applied to your property? And then here's a question about, would it be harmful to other neighbors in the immediate vicinity? So this needs to be submitted along with your application for a variance. You can also look at the approval standards that the board uses when they are applying the code to each case. So this is what the board is looking at every single time for every single case. So I hope that was helpful. And please let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.